This is the first part of the lecture on aquatic biodiversity. This is your book, Chapter 8, and then we're going to start with an overview of all aquatic systems. This is Section 1. So Section 1 starts off by telling us, hopefully something that's a review. Saltwater and freshwater are the essence of our planet. 3/4 of the Earth's surface is covered in water, and the oceans are the dominant form. So saltwater is where we will find most of our life forms. And then 8.1 really talks more in depth about limiting factors that are going to help to determine what type of biodiversity and how much biodiversity can be supported in aquatic systems. And those are really important. I don't believe they all come up on another slide, and so I want to point them out right here. They are, starting right here, temperature, dissolved oxygen content, availability of food, and availability of light and nutrients necessary for photosynthesis. So once we have those in place, that's everything that we need for the net primary productivity. The base of the food chain is well nourished, and we can have then our animal species up the food chain as well. What we see first is a picture of the planet without any of the ice caps. So if you're looking over here, we don't see the North Polar ice cap. But what we are able to see is that if we were to split the globe in half at the equator and to look at the to sort of look at it in this perspective, we have essentially a ocean hemisphere and a land ocean hemisphere. If we're looking at that first picture, really the only thing that we see there is Australia, and coincidentally the other name for the continent of Australia is Oceania. So again, it's about the only big land mass that we have there centered in the ocean hemisphere. Everything else is in that land ocean hemisphere. Predominantly you see Africa and we see Eurasia. So again, the ocean is going to make up most of the Earth's surface. 71% of the Earth's surface is salt water. And that global ocean is divided into 4 areas. I know that this has changed since I was in school, so I'm not sure what you guys learned back when you were in elementary school. But there are only 4 oceans now that are recognized: the Atlantic, the Pacific, the Arctic, and the Indian. Those are our 4 major global oceans. The Pacific has a little asterisk next to it because it is the largest by far. And then if we look down the next blank, freshwater makes up 2.2% of the Earth's surface. But again, this freshwater is incredibly useful to us because that's where our drinking water is going to come from. Now, in terms of biodiversity, it won't have nearly as much as the oceans. And so that's what we're focusing on in this unit, is the parallel aquatic biodiversity, like we just covered in Chapter 7 in the book, land or terrestrial biodiversity. So this is essentially biomes in the ocean or in freshwater. And again, we're going to see that most of the Earth is covered with that salt water. So if we break down these life zones into saltwater or freshwater, we can look at it a different way. Our first saltwater or marine aquatic life zone is the oceans and the estuaries. Now, estuaries, there's a little bit of overlap, at least in my opinion, with estuaries and coastland. Estuaries are those areas where the ocean is meeting fresh water. And so it could be an inlet, it could be simply a river running out into the ocean. But because of the tides, you are going to have some back and forth sloshing of the saltwater, fresh water, and not a clear boundary exists in an estuary. The next bullet down, coastlands and shorelines. These are those areas, the beachy areas. We tend to see a lot of bird species because there are a lot of filter feeders. There's going to be a lot of very shallow fish. And also, because it's shallow, that's where we're going to have a lot of producers. And so we see a lot of biodiversity on the coastlands. Speaking of biodiversity, coral reefs are incredibly biodiverse. Just have to think about the opening scene in Finding Nemo, and you can imagine the type and diversity of life that exists there. And the last one mentioned is a mangrove forest. These tend to lie around the estuary areas, and we've got a map in a minute that will show you where the mangroves are. But mangroves are incredibly important because they anchor the soil right near those areas where, again, the tides are washing in and out. So the mangroves are there helping to prevent erosion, but also the way that mangroves root into the soil and the sand allows an extra protective habitat for nurseries of fish. And so you do get a lot of biodiversity here, and it becomes very, very important to growing populations in the ocean. Now then, if we go down to our freshwater aquatic zones, we see lakes, rivers and streams, and inland wetlands. And there are some major differences there. Obviously, a lake is a large body of water. It is going to be characteristically slow moving water, whereas rivers and streams, they're going to be much smaller in scope, and the water moves much quicker. That's really the defining characteristic there between a lake and a river or stream system, is how fast is the water going to be moving, and we'll learn those terms here in a minute. And then we've got inland wetlands, and those are areas not by the coast, but areas like could be in the middle of a prairie, it could be in the middle of a suburban area. But these inland wetlands have to be wet for part of the year, and they're going to support an immense amount of biodiversity that otherwise might not have any wet areas to thrive in. A lot of the inland wetlands are purely seasonal, especially when we talk about up further north where snowmelt is going to fill up these little divots and low-lying areas. But an inland wetland could be more like a swamp, it could be a marsh. Those would all apply to inland wetlands. So if we look at this picture, this is the one I was referring to when I said we would see where mangroves are growing. You can see in this diagram the mangroves are the green areas and the coral reefs are the red areas. Lakes and rivers are also shown in blue on the land masses. But if we do look at where the mangroves and coral reefs are, hopefully you will notice that they lie exactly between the 30 south and the 30 north parallels lines of latitude. And so this is where we would also expect to find more of our rainforest type habitats, and so it is also where we find our mangroves. Mangroves are incredibly important again to coastal areas. The only place in the United States that has them is Florida. Again, it is our only tropical climate as well, so there is a very, very clear parallel there. Now, if we look at coral reefs again, you see the same thing. Those coral reefs have to be located fairly near to land or on some type of underground raised ridge. And the reason for that is that there is photosynthesis going on in the corals, and so they need to have good exposure to sunlight. And so we can see the coral reefs. We do not have a whole lot of them over here in North America, South America area. There are some in the Gulf, again, very few compared to if we look over off the coast of Africa, off the coast of India, Indonesia, and of course Australia. And you can see that bright band of red off the coast of Australia. And that would of course be the Great Barrier Reef. Any of those little dots that you see in the ocean, they should be on some type of a ridge again or close to an island where you have a land mass that has formed in the middle of the ocean. The reasons why oceans are so good for us, and this is again human-centric, is they do offer a lot of biological productivity. A lot of that we're going to rely on in the last bullet there, goods and services. But for the ecosystem as a whole, they do provide us a great base for biological productivity. They also do a great job for climate regulation. If we think about places that are located near the ocean, they tend to have very temperate climates, especially if you compare them to an area of the same latitude that is not on the ocean. A common one that's cited is looking at the climate of England or especially London and then comparing that to something around the same latitude, which might be more like Minnesota. So obviously going to be a much nicer climate in London because they're surrounded by an ocean. They also have a huge role in biogeochemical cycles. And we've talked about how they exchange carbon with the atmosphere. They're also a good storehouse for sulfur, phosphorus runoff, any of those that are going to be released through runoff into the water cycle. Those are all going to come down there. Speaking of water, you've got tons of evaporation going on with the ocean. So there is a role for the ocean in all of our biogeochemical cycles. Again, biodiversity, because we've got that productivity, because we've covered such a large surface area, there is a ton of biodiversity. And again, that is important to us as humans for goods and services. We eat fish, we eat shellfish, we take minerals from the ocean. Sulfur is one, but also manganese is something incredibly important for our military that we have to get from the ocean. Recreation, there are people who go for vacation or who have personal boats and watercraft. So again, recreation is a big thing for humans and goods and services. And then transportation routes for shipping. One of the first ways that we set out and explored was to find ways to trade. And so oceans become incredibly important, even still today, for shipments from China where air would be way too costly. You can't ship freight that way. And so going with ocean barges is really the best and cheapest, most effective way to get those goods and services moved from continent to continent. Aquatic species are going to live either in the top, the middle, or the bottom layers of the water, depending on what they need to nourish themselves and depending on how they fare as swimmers. And so we break them up into these general categories. Plankton are weakly swimming or free-floating organisms. You have phytoplankton. The phyto there should tell you that these are plankton that are going to go through photosynthesis because they enjoy that light. The phyto is the light. Zooplankton, we see there the prefix zoo, which is animals. So these are single-celled animals all the way up to jellyfish, but they're more animal-like. I shouldn't say that they're all animals. They could be bacteria, but they're animal-like in nature. And ultraplankton are photosynthetic bacteria that account for 70% of the ocean's net primary productivity. So again, you've got the phytoplankton, but we also have what we call ultraplankton. Difference here is these are bacteria. They are not plant-like. They are simply the photosynthetic bacteria. Going back to the zooplankton again, any organism that is weakly swimming is going to be considered plankton. Now, for certain animals, that changes over time. You have a larval form and then you have an adult form. So eventually, something like a jellyfish might become a better swimmer, although they're still going to be very weakly swimming, pretty much going along with the water. But something like a squid, in its initial stages of life, is going to be a plankton and eventually will become a better swimmer. So some other terms, we've got nekton. Nekton are strongly swimming consumers. Something like a shark would be a nekton. Benthos, benthic, all that, benth means bottom. So a benthos is a bottom-dwelling species. And then, of course, we have to have decomposers. By now you should know that you have to have producers, you have to have decomposers to make an ecosystem work. And again, these are those limiting factors we talked about in the very beginning, so I was wrong, they did come up again. Key factors: temperature, dissolved oxygen content, that's the oxygen that fish are able to take in and use. They still breathe oxygen, but they get it dissolved in the water. The availability of food, light, nutrients, especially if we're talking about that food chain, we've got to have light for photosynthesis. Turbidity is the name of the measurement of the cloudiness of the water. And again, those nutrients are incredibly important. And where are they coming from? They're coming from the land. They're coming from those biogeochemical cycles, and then they're running off into the coast through the streams and the rivers, especially our nitrates and phosphates. And that's going to lead us to an issue that we'll discuss in the next part.